Okay. Our topic today is consciousness and art. And our first speaker is Professor Robert Pepperell. He's a professor of fine art at Cardiff Metropolitan University and director of research at Phobotech. As an artist, Professor Pepperell exhibited at Ars Electronica at the Barbican Gallery, among other prestigious institutions. And as an academic, he collaborated with psychologists and vision scientists to investigate the nature of the conscious mind and understand visual experience and how it can be recorded. And he has developed a new form of natural perspective that has now been developed as a real-time 2D engine technology. So Professor Pepperell, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. Yeah, so I was initially very excited when Nicole made the invitation, particularly as the topic is consciousness and art, which are two things that I've been working on for all my career, really. But when I started to think about what to say, I quickly became overwhelmed because both consciousness and art are notoriously difficult things to define. And then when you put the two together, they're both enormous topics that, you know, I mean, I've only got 20 minutes. So rather than trying to make a kind of detailed argument with evidence and data and so on, what I thought I'd do instead, I hope you don't mind, is to present something as more like a reflection on an idea about how consciousness and art relate to one another. And I'll refer to some scientific work, but I won't go into any detail. I'll give you links to papers and so on that you can follow up if you're interested. But the point I'd really like to try and get over to you is that art experience offers a privileged window into the workings of the human mind, both conscious and unconscious, actually. And I'm not totally sure that the conscious and unconscious minds are abruptly separate from one another. You know, there's arguments about the extent to which they're graded and overlap and so on. But putting that argument aside for the moment, the general claim is that by thinking about art, by looking at the way art works, it gives us a privileged view of the way that the human mind more generally is working. And I'm just going to give you three briefly presented examples of where I think that's exemplified. So what do I mean by the privileged window? The full experience of art, I think, engages mental processes that usually occur automatically and outside of our immediate awareness. And when people are really engaged with works of art, they're not just kind of superficially looking at them, but they're actually involved in them and contemplating them and so on, then very often people can undergo some kind of heightened or altered state of consciousness, which is sometimes talked about in terms of aesthetic experience, which is characterized by magnifying features of our more mundane or everyday awareness. So it's not a totally separate kind of experience from our normal everyday experience, but it magnifies or amplifies certain features of that experience in a special way, is the claim I want to make. And the first example of that I want to discuss, so I hope you can't see that, the first example I want to discuss is what I call visual indeterminacy. And visual indeterminacy is defined as when an image or a scene suggests the presence of recognizable objects, but at the same time defies easy or immediate recognition. And probably a lot of you are familiar with this kind of image, which is, you know, now very famous, which illustrates what visual indeterminacy means. So at first glance, you know, when I first saw this image, it looked like a patchwork of dark and light blobs, and I couldn't see anything in it. I couldn't recognize anything in it. Normally, when I show this to an audience, you know, I do it interactively and try and get a sense of how many people can actually see the object. I can't do that here, but just to let you know, it's a picture of a cow. Some of you may know that. It may help you to know it's a cow to recognize it. But if you don't, there's a slightly easier example. Another high contrast image. When I add some more information, you can see that the cow is there. And once you know that the cow is there, it's much easier to see it in the higher contrast image and quite hard to get it out of your mind. A lot of people have studied this kind of phenomena in visual psychology. I've been interested in it for a very long time from an artistic point of view, actually going back to when I was a student, undergraduate student. And for many years, in different ways, I've been experimenting with making images that are visually indeterminate. So here's just a couple of examples of paintings I've made that try to induce this state in the viewer of kind of hovering between recognition and abstraction. It turns out to be very hard to do. It took me a very long time to find a way of doing it that was even remotely successful. And it turns out, and I didn't realize for a long time, that this is something that many artists have been aware of and have specifically exploited in their art practice. There are many examples throughout art history. There's just one here from Gerhard Richter, who many of you will know is a very kind of prominent contemporary artist, who's very clear about this in his own writings. He says, pictures which are interpretable and which contain a meaning are bad pictures. A good picture presents itself as the unmanageable, the illogical, the meaningless. It demonstrates the endless multiplicity of aspects. It takes away our certainty because it deprives a thing of its meaning and its name. It shows us a thing in all the manifold significance and infinite variety that preclude the emergence of any single meaning or view. And I could give you many other examples of artists who've said similar things or have made works of art that have a similar kind of effect. So if you're interested in this topic, there's a paper here which kind of summarizes my own work in the area and references a lot of other artists who've thought about this same issue. I also collaborate, Nicole mentioned at the beginning, I collaborated with perception scientists and neuroscientists on several issues, but this one in particular. So this is a couple of stimuli from a study, a neuroscience study done with Alamat Ishai, a neuroscientist, where we compared examples of my own indeterminate images to recognizable images. And we looked at several things: behavioral responses, aesthetic responses, neurophysiological responses. And I won't go into the details of the studies and what we found. I think we found lots of interesting things. But just to kind of summarize that body of work, really, which a lot of that summary appears in this paper from 2011, indeterminate images frustrate what is normally a rapid and automatic process of segmentation and recognition. And we saw this happening behaviorally and neurophysiologically. This often causes viewers to engage with the indeterminate image more closely and to become more aware of the mental processes that normally occur unconsciously. And this tends to increase aesthetic appreciation. Ironically, you might think it would have the opposite effect. And artists have long exploited this visual indeterminacy effect to heighten the aesthetic experience and impact of their work. So that's the first example. The second is something I call visual dichotomy. And this occurs when pictures or sculptures have a dichotomous or contradictory nature, in which there appear to be two or sometimes more distinct and incompatible things at the same time. So an example would be two pieces of sculpture from the 20th century. One you've probably seen, you may have seen these works in real life, Picasso's Bullhead, which is in Paris in the Picasso Museum, and this work by Sarah Lucas. So with the Picasso Bullhead, you immediately see the head of an animal, but you also see at the same time parts of a bicycle. And in that perception, one does not exclude the other. When you see the bull's head, it's not as if you don't continue to see the bicycle parts. The same in the Sarah Lucas piece. You see a body, looks like a human body of sorts, but at the same time you see fabric and material and wood and so on. And so very often in sculpture and in painting, we're put in this kind of double bind situation where we're seeing something as something else without negating the original perception. And some people have argued that this may be linked to the origins of art in human culture, in the very beginnings of human culture. So people have speculated that when early humans found, say, stones that look like faces, for example, they may have felt they're much more significant than other kinds of stones, and they may have taken them and used them in some way. They may have even amplified that impression by carving slightly or adapting them to look more like faces, let's say. And so this capacity humans have for seeing things in other things, I'm not sure it's unique to humans, but it's certainly highly developed in humans and part of our kind of unique cognitive capacities. In fact, there's a museum in Japan I discovered recently that's just full of examples of these stones that look like faces. This one supposedly looks like Elvis. And recently, some geologists found this example of a rock formation that looks like the Cookie Monster. So this propensity we have to see things in natural forms is a kind of fundamental and important part of our visual processing. And it's something that artists throughout history actually have exploited. So this painting by Chuck Close, which again many of you will probably know his work, these paintings are often very big, and if you get close to them, you see these what look like abstract patches of color and shape. But as you move back away, you start to see these kind of photographic looking like representations, and you can actually hover in between the two as you move backwards and forwards, and sort of quite magically the face appears out of this noise. And really what artists like Chuck Close and many others are doing is drawing your attention to the fabric or the material from which the image is made, whilst at the same time asserting the representational nature of the image. So you're locked into this kind of, again, double situation where you're seeing something that is both paint or pattern and a face at the same time. And this paper talks about this phenomenon and about perhaps the psychological and neuropsychological and physical aspect, philosophical aspects around it. And to summarize that work, what I claim is that representational works of art exploit this innate capacity to perceive objects in two contradictory ways simultaneously. In everyday life, this capacity goes largely unnoticed. So when we look at the television or a movie or look at a photograph in a newspaper, we tend not to know that we are seeing two things at the same time, each of which are incompatible with the other. But artists have long exploited this for aesthetic effect by drawing our attention to it, and so amplifying what I call a kind of cognitive dissonance, not in the way that phrase is used elsewhere in psychology, but the kind of dissonance between two states that appear simultaneously in our perception. And then the third example I want to draw your attention to is egocentric perspective. The fact that we see the world or experience the world from an embodied egocentric perspective. And artists have articulated this effect in various ways throughout art history. So to show you what I mean, this is a drawing I did on the iPad of my own visual field, looking at my foot there in the middle. And this is a view through one eye, so you can see my nose on the right there. I've tried to describe everything in my visual field as accurately as I could in terms of spatial geometry and layout. And so one of the things that becomes apparent when you try and do this is how much you see of your own body in your everyday visual experience. It tends to be in the visual periphery, so we tend not to be aware of it so much. But it's very, very important that we do see our own bodies in terms of grounding us in the world. And you'll probably know certainly the image on the left there, the famous drawing by Ernst Mach, where he did something very similar, and Gibson updated that in the 1950s, what he called the modern visual ego, to emphasize this kind of embodied perspective we have on the world and how that conditions our relationship to reality, perceptually speaking. And so again, there are many examples of where artists have drawn attention to this and made it a feature of their work. So this painting by Frida Kahlo, for example, many of you will know again, and Joan Semmel, who's an American artist who throughout her career has made a whole series of drawings and paintings of her own visual perspective, including her own body. And as an interesting kind of side note to this, again, going back to very early human art, these Venus figurines, which have been found in various parts of Europe, are very mysterious objects. I mean, they have tend not to have feet. They have these kind of heads without faces, and we don't really know why they're made in the way that they are. Why they have these kind of very rotund bodies, and various people have come up with various ideas. But one interesting theory actually was put forward in the mid 1990s by an anthropologist, is that rather than looking at them kind of from an external perspective in the way we normally might look at a sculpture, it's argued that these were meant to be viewed from an embodied perspective. And when the Venus figurines are photographed from the head position, if you like, McDermott argues that they closely resemble a pregnant woman's body as she would see it from her own point of view. I'm not sure this theory, got much traction amongst his peers. There's a commentary paper about this where I think most people who write commentary don't agree with it. But subsequently, other artifacts have been found. This object was found in 2009, and it does actually have a little loop on the top, which suggests that this was worn as a pendant around someone's neck, and that it would have been viewed from this kind of embodied first-person perspective, if you like. So I think that adds strength to that argument. And again, this is all discussed in this paper if you want to find out more. The conclusions from this work are that this egocentric perspective is a basic feature of our perception that conditions much of our experience of the world and our relationship to it. We tend not to be aware that the world appears to us and that we appear to ourselves through this perspective, but artists have often been highly aware of it and highly aware of this aspect of our mental life, and drawn attention to it through their work. So just to summarize my claim, having shown you a few examples of where I think it's exemplified, art experience offers, I think, this privileged window into the workings of the human mind. The full experience of art engages mental processes that usually occur automatically and outside of our immediate awareness. And when we're fully engaged with works of art, we undergo a heightened or altered state of consciousness, sometimes called aesthetic experience, that magnifies features of more mundane or everyday awareness. And I came across a quote from Bridget Riley a couple of days ago, which really exemplifies this idea. She was talking about these black and white paintings she made in the 1960s. And she says, "I wanted to bring about some fresh way of seeing again what had already almost certainly been experienced, but which had either been dismissed or buried by the passage of time, that thrill of pleasure which sight itself reveals." And I think this exemplifies what artists are very often trying to do in their work, is to bring to the forefront of our attention and of our experience things that often remain in the twilight of our experience, or even buried somewhere in memory or unconsciousness. And there's a certain thrill that happens when they do that successfully. I thought I'd close just by making a few general observations about working between art and science, and particularly, working on questions like consciousness and perception. And I hope, these are just general reflections. I hope there was some interest and benefit to people who either working in this field or thinking about working in it. And I hope some of these things will tie in as well to what Liliana's going to talk about as well. So I just offer these as general observations, really. But one thing I think is really important in this field, and it almost goes without saying, but sometimes it does need to be said, is that the phenomenology is primary here. And I'm sure Liliana will agree with this, that it's the experience that we're interested in. That's what we're trying to understand. And from my point of view, I always start with the phenomenology, whether it's from drawing or from trying to design an experiment or look at a particular question. What is the phenomenology that we're trying to understand and explain in its fullest sense? How do we understand that phenomenology in its fullest sense possible? Secondly, ecological methods are valid. Ecologically valid methods are preferable, but are obviously very difficult to put into practice. So you can certainly learn things from showing people images in labs on screens. I've done a lot of that kind of work myself, but where possible, using real artworks in ecologically valid settings, it should be attempted as well, notwithstanding all the difficulties that it creates. And here's an example of a piece that actually a study I'm working on with Nicole, amongst other collaborators, which is looking at the effect of curvature, with preference for curvature in art. And we're fortunate to be able to set this up in a museum in Spain a year or so ago, and do some experiments in the museum, and collect a different kind of data from that we'd normally collect online or through computer screens. Another point which I used to have to make a lot, but I find is less and less necessary to make. I think people are kind of generally understanding this now, but that art and aesthetics are not necessarily about beauty or pleasure or comfort. There's a very important aspect of art appreciation which is really nothing to do with beauty in the traditional sense. It's a more complex situation, and we can point to many examples throughout the history of art. I mean, here's one that struck me very powerfully when I was a young art student. When I saw this for the first time, I couldn't believe how kind of ugly and badly painted and crude this image was when I saw it in the museum. I found it almost kind of repellent, but I realized it must be in some way important, partly because it was in a museum, and partly because it was having this kind of effect on me. So there's other things going on in art besides beauty and comfort and so on that are really important and need to be borne in mind and taken into account. This picture by Bridget Riley, for example, to go back to her, is very difficult to look at just on a purely perceptual level, very disorientating and quite painful to look at in some ways. So yeah, it's a very important point to make, I think. And then it's really important as well to take notice of what artists say about what they're doing. There's an enormous repository of data out there in artists' writings, and also in the writings of critics and historians and philosophers of art, which are really about the phenomenology of art, and in fact, more than that, about what the phenomenology of what it is to be human and to experience the world at all. And it's surprising how little I find, how little this work is referenced, how little, how infrequently artists' thoughts and writings are taken into account when we're thinking about the work that they've made. And then very finally, the last thing I want to say is that what this has all brought me to is a kind of body of work that I'm doing at the moment, which I'm very excited about, and which it makes me feel kind of optimistic and quite confident that we are making really good progress in these deep questions about what it is to experience, what human consciousness is, how we can understand it. And my own kind of attempt to contribute to this is by bringing this knowledge to bear from art experience and applying that to questions that are being studied in other disciplines, cognitive neuroscience and so on, to look for similarities and comparisons and overlaps. So as I've said today, art experience, I think, is marked by this heightened state of complexity in perception and cognition compared to non-aesthetic experience. And by complexity, I mean a state that's characterized by both high degrees of diversity and unity, or differentiation and integration, when many distinct elements coalesce without losing their identity. And there's this lovely quote by Picasso, which I think summarizes that much more elegantly than I've just said it. When looking at a picture, one should say the more associations it makes me think of, the better. And there's a lovely illustration of this by Saul Steinberg, which was on the front of the New Yorker, somebody looking at a Braque painting and illustrating the kind of chain of thought, the complex chain of thought that work of art generates. And very interestingly as well, recent work in neuroscience of consciousness seems to be pointing towards the fact that conscious states, as opposed to unconscious states or semi-conscious states, are marked by higher degrees of complexity and diversity in the neural dynamics. And for me, at least, that's a very interesting clue as to how we might be able to link the complexity of the phenomenology to the underlying neural processes that may be supporting it. And of course, the aim of all this is to try and integrate somehow these these large domains into a coherent idea about what's going on when we experience a work of art. And there's a couple of papers here that talk about that. And yeah, thank you for your attention, and thanks to the organisers for setting the event up. Thank you.